that name.
After 20 long, extensive years from playing the original Resident Evil 2 on the PlayStation 1, it's finally time for us to talk about Capcom's enthralling E3 2018 surprises outside of Devil May Cry 5. Most Resident Evil fans on the planet are no strangers to the remake premise. If you've been around since that prestigious time in the GameCube era where Nintendo published Resident Evil exclusively, then you would know that Shinji Mikami took a stab at this with Remake 1, creating a seemingly perfect, menacing, more turbulent version of Resident Evil 1 that utilized familiar elements while adding relatively new elements like new creatures and new areas. The game, for its time, was a definition of what a remake should be, adding and expanding on the lore, setting up on a foreboding sense of what has been established from the previous games before that time period. The Resident Evil 2 remake is finally upon us after a complete binge session on copious amounts of information, re-watching trailers thoroughly, examining every detail, Easter egg, change, scene, and gameplay demonstration that I could find. I can safely say that I love these presentations. I loved these trailers to death. It keeps what you would expect from Resident Evil with slow-moving zombies, recreating Raccoon City under a new microscope, and subverting expectations much like the original remake did, with several alterations to the Raccoon City Police Department as well. Everything has been remade, reimagined with a new lens that might be done for better or for worse. At least there's a fucking bathroom now, thank God, because in the original game, the burning question was, where did zombies, where did police officers all go to take a piss and take a shit? This has been the highlight of fan speculation for years, and finally this game fully delivers. Thank Christ. All jokes aside, we're merely talking about what content expands on the original format, everything that I seen in the trailers, including the gameplay demo that was presented at E3, and also we're talking about the things that are burning questions that I would want to see reintroduced in this new game. But first, we have to talk about the enormous elephant in the room. Before we go any further, Over the Shoulder has been confirmed, boys! I told you, I told people this would happen. I didn't think there was going to be any other way that this gameplay formula would be approached other than using the third-person perspective, and the die-hard Resident Evil purists are quite livid. However, I guess it's super easy to refute their claims with the simple logic of tank controls and fixed camera angles largely being absent when it comes to modernized gaming. Let's be honest, can you think of a title after Resident Evil 6 that featured large, prominent sections of gameplay built on fixed camera angles that wasn't an indie title? 20 seconds on the clock, I'll wait for an answer. Time's up. The answer is quite simple. Tank controls and fixed camera angles have been phased out when it comes to modern gaming and modern survival horror games. While it was a unique gimmick for the time period, it clearly hasn't aged well. You can tell that tank controls and a fixed camera angle were made to be annoying. Even Capcom stated themselves that this gimmicky gameplay was only made on the foundation that you couldn't see enemies from around the next corner. Maybe 20 years ago, or maybe during the time the first remake was announced in the early 2000s, that gameplay style could really suffice, but not now. I guess Resident Evil 4, despite being an exceptional action game, left a sour taste in people's mouth when it came to revitalizing the controls. But honestly, this is a wise idea. Resident Evil 4 still played particularly well despite all the blowback from the community, so I really don't see the issue unless this game wasn't trying to gun for real survival horror. That is one of the rampant positives for this game that is being thoroughly undervalued. This isn't a third-person shooter trying to be like Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. This is a third-person shooter all about survival horror elements. People said it couldn't be done, but Dead Space 1 took the reins and thoroughly succeeded with OTS in my opinion. Zombies are ironclad warriors now. They take a surprising number of bullets to the head before succumbing to their wounds. This feature already puts claims of the game being too easy to rest, since people said that easy headshots were going to be a thing, and it just doesn't seem possible with the limited amount of ammo and the fact that the zombies are now bullet sponges. It seems like a bad idea to shoot every zombie in the head, and maybe running past them is a better alternative. Leon can no longer shake off enemies like Resident Evil 4, instead utilizing another feature that was in the first remake with a defensive stab. If you have an available knife in your inventory, you can defend yourself from being grabbed. Your routine combat knife can now stop a bite at the expense of downing a zombie and retrieving it from his dead body, which could make this difficult if he has friends around. The knife can also break if you're hoping to repeatedly slash down enemies forever like you could in Resident Evil 4. It's just not possible in this game. Enemies also don't drop ammo and resources, so I think it's not out of the ordinary to say that you might have a game that's over the shoulder, but you don't have a game that's precisely akin to Resident Evil 4's gameplay mechanics outside of the camera angle being OTS. To my knowledge, this game appears to be a big amalgamation of Resident Evil 4's camera, Resident Evil 7's crosshairs and inventory, and the thematics and blueprint that Resident Evil Remake 1 created, with the latter and penultimate mechanics being quite apparent. One thing I will say is that I loved the attention to detail when it comes to this new RE engine. I've said it before and I'll say it again, the Resident Evil engine looks incredible. Every pore, every creepy display of gore and disgusting detail has all been migrated into this experience. Zombie heads are now flayed off completely if you manage to get a headshot with a shotgun, which made me cringe the first time I saw it on live stream. It added a touch of realism that I can only imagine getting worse when it comes to the aforementioned death scenes from Resident Evil 2 being redone for the modern masses. Another thing that is also really important is our expectations being subverted more and more. The Raccoon City Police Department is the same interior, but certain sections have been drastically changed. Shutters are now implemented, which are reminiscent to Resident Evil 1.5. The library requires manual movement of the bookcases. The third floor is heavily expanded. The liquor crawling on the window occurs upstairs as opposed to downstairs, and barriers can be placed on windows now, like Resident Evil Outbreak. Even Marvin's placement is largely different, expanding his role to give more intel to Leon before he ultimately turns. Making an impact on difference is actually good because going into the game, I actually enjoy being surprised, not being aware of my surroundings, not being aware of the same story beats. Yet again, doing older and newer tasks might pad out the gameplay to be a bit more enjoyable with new and older set pieces doses of horror and suspense. I'm not surprised since the developers mentioned Metroidvania was going to be more applicable than ever considering the adventure elements of Resident Evil 2. I really love this sense of upgrading mechanics to be within reason. Gunpowder is also a new addition, which was also in Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil 7, which might give you a fighting chance just when you might know you're a little bit low on ammo. The maps are even darker to supplement this feeling that you still don't know what is lurking behind the next corner. This is very similar to what Invader Studios tried to pull off with Resident Evil 2 Reborn. What they did there was that they made the maps darker, they made things hard to see, and they implemented a new flashlight mechanic, which Resident Evil 2 Remake does as well. It's no surprise Invader visited Capcom. Maybe Capcom took their advice. Still though, the visibility in this game, despite not being as bad as Resident Evil 2 Reborn, is still your worst enemy. Hopefully we have the ability to turn on the lights in the station during backtracking from the parking lot all the way back to the interrogation room to get extra items and open the doors there. One thing that I've noticed is that the health system appears on screen when you drop from fine to caution to danger. You don't have to pause anymore to see if you're blatantly in trouble. The door animations are also gone, making the whole experience seamless instead of waiting to load into rooms. One could argue that the sense of dread was taken away with no door loaders. This dread still exists, however, if zombies or Mr. X breaks through walls or doors in real time just to get to you. There's no door loader option anymore to reset enemies either. I can only imagine that the thrill of the chase would be amplified with this in mind. With all of my complete praise, with all of my examination of this game, you must be wondering if there are negatives from what I have seen and burning questions that need to be addressed. You would be correct to some extent. I do overall like what Resident Evil 2 Remake is giving me, but I do have some problems. I'll begin with the obvious. The A and B scenarios have been removed, as well as the zapping system. The zapping system essentially meant that things you could do in one campaign would affect the other. If Leon took a side pack, Claire would be left with a submachine gun. If you scanned a fingerprint in the labs in scenario A, you would gain extra goodies and extra access to a room by doing the same thing in scenario B. It added quite a bit of replay value to the game. However, Capcom did mention that they were modifying these campaigns even if they are done separately. My personal hope for the trade-off is that the Claire campaign is still radically different from Leon's and vice versa. I hope that they keep the promise of having these two characters interact a little bit more than they did in the original. Maybe you can get new items and weapons from each other just by simply meeting up. As I've mentioned, I hope the trade-off gives us more. While the non-canon scenarios like Leon A and Claire B was disregarded as official canon in the original Resident Evil lore, it still was a blast playing them just to see exactly what happened when it came to each character's non-canon scenarios. Originally, I also had issues with the soundtrack at first sounding relatively subtle for this version of the game, where I could barely notice any of the original composition that has been reworked for this new soundtrack. I missed the melodic, unnerving music that was more apparent in the original Resident Evil 2. Granted, the demo is certainly an unfinished product and not an indicator of the final result. After giving this more thought, digging deeper into the music tracks, this game does feature reworked versions of the Resident Evil 2 soundtrack. They just sound a lot more faint and creepy, which is taking some time to grow on me, but overall, I'm liking the idea here. Even if you aren't a fan of this new soundtrack, at least they give you the incentive to switch it via in-game options if you decide to pre-order the digital deluxe edition at about $70. Just take a listen at the new and old basement of the police station theme, for example. I am certainly disappointed with Claire Redfield's new redesign. It's not bad, just generic. It looks like her costume was ripped straight from Revelations 2 with her sniper outfit. It's just not as iconic as the badass biker booty shorts. The rest is just burning questions that need to be addressed, since some of the 4chan leaks were right, but a good majority were also wrong, given the fact that the Hunkin' Tofu minigame won't be rebranded as DLC. To give people even further aspirations, to hope that Capcom just aren't erroneous liars who always eat their words. They did say, and I quote, "We're basing this remake on the existing game and we are respecting its roots as much as possible, but we really also felt that we wanted to add new things for the player to experience, whether they know Resident Evil 2 by heart or whether they are coming in as new players." I hope the ability to turn prompts off will be added to make the situation feel far more immersive over the constant display of context-sensitive X buttons, reminding the player that yes, this item is here, yes, this puzzle is here, and maybe you should examine it. I would have personally preferred item glinting to aid players in exploring the map over said button prompts, but that's just a small nitpick altogether. At least you do have to manually walk to things to activate said prompts, and they aren't in giant neon lights compared to the ejective PDA in Resident Evil 6. There's also a weird yellow tape system in play. It tells you about areas of interest on the map or where to go in certain locations. This screams casualization in my opinion. It wasn't like this initially. In Resident Evil 2, you can find keys that will open up several rooms, and then the rest of the map will be up to your visual deducing to see if that item that you had aligned with the color coding of said locked room. Resident Evil 6 and 7 does give you the ability to shut off certain indicators, so I'm wondering if that will happen for this remake. At least it's cool that Leon marks things down on his map like Silent Hill once he sees them, so not all hope is lost with this new investigation system, and we haven't seen what will exactly be disabled on hard mode. It is a shame that normal mode will have autosaves attached to the typewriter like RE7, but apparently hard mode gives you limited saves, so I know what I'll be personally choosing on my first playthrough of the game. I do need those precious ink ribbons in my life. I was initially going to place the rumor of the sewer gator being cut here because I dislike remakes or reimaginations that keeps cutting out content from the base game. Luckily, thanks to Polygon and the producer of Resident Evil 2 Remake H, he mentioned that the creature was going to remain in the game despite what the rumors mentioned. The dev team did pinpoint the possibility of removing that boss due to having trouble making him fit in the game world at first. It's a weird statement to make, considering the fact that the Resident Evil universe has zombies, 9-foot tall tyrants, and whatever bubblegum monster William Birkin becomes at the end of that game. How is all that possible in this universe, but they are saying that an animal being clearly infected by the T-virus, growing 3 times its size, is out of the realm of possibility for this universe? It doesn't make sense to me. Resident Evil has never been a franchise to ground itself in realism for far too long, and I think that much is obvious. Look at what you're fighting, for Christ's sake. One could argue that the Gator boss was definitely way too easy if you dislodge the propane tank, and I agree with that. Since he's being reimagined, hopefully they have the knowledge to just make him different. Make him equivalent to a boss that hunts you down, a little bit like Killer Croc did to Batman in the first Arkham game. However, kudos to Capcom for keeping my fears alleviated and debunking yet another 4chan rumor, since half of them were surprisingly true in the leaks. That being said, my burning questions are: will Claire get a more traditional costume? I'm not really a fan of the new one, so luckily, hopefully, there will be alternative costumes in the base game that we probably don't know about outside of DLC costumes. Will Claire get custom weapon parts like Leon can in this new game? Alright, so the grenade launcher, right? Claire's grenade launcher, it was really fucking badass. One of the criticisms that I had about Claire's campaign was that her weapon variety is really low. So I'm hoping that she gets new reimagined guns and shit like that. Maybe she gets upgrades for like the spark shot. It would be really cool if she gets custom parts. Maybe they could make her have explosive bowgun bolts, since the series did that later with Resident Evil Code Veronica. So that would make total sense if they reimagine things and make her campaign feel a little bit more better when it comes to getting custom weapons and upgrading your weapons entirely. That would be cool. What about head stomps returning? Okay, so this is a cool question. Back in the original Resident Evil 2, even the original Resident Evil 1, if a zombie grabs your leg and bites you, you get a free head stomp. You can kill that zombie. If he bites you, your character will kick his head off or do some shit like that. Leon was bit in the back of the calf and he sort of got out of it. He ran away. So I'm wondering if head stomps will return if a zombie grabs you while down in the front and you stomp his head. That would be cool if that came back, but I'm not really sure about it. It's up to Capcom to bring that back or not. Will there be Crimson Heads in Resident Evil 2 Remake? V-Act was established in the original Resident Evil 1 Remake, I believe, where the zombies, after a certain period of time, they could get back up and regenerate and they could run at the player. That was a very scary concept, and you needed kerosene to burn their bodies. It only makes sense in this game to do it by random chance, because the kerosene idea would probably make this game a lot more harder than need be. Unless they put a new difficulty or something, I just don't see it currently. But I would love to see Crimson Heads again. I am personally an avid fan of running zombies, and the style of third-person gameplay would make that a lot more tense. You had Crimson Heads in Operation Raccoon City, and that game is super boring, so they could make Crimson Heads work. I just think that it should be ORC logic in the fact that it is random chance instead of kerosene and burning. Next question, will they use some elements that was exclusive to only the ports of Resident Evil 2 on the N64? The N64 game had additional costumes and files, I believe, so it will only make sense to use those since they are bringing some of the files into the expanded lore with the characters showing up like David Ford, and also I think that Edward Elliot has an expanded role, and I think they're also bringing in characters from Resident Evil Outbreak. So yes, maybe those files would be important to add more story beats to this game. The last burning question I have here is, how will knife only runs work on bosses if the knife has a durability meter that will break over time? This is a question that Capcom really should take into consideration if they decide to treat knife only runs worth any grain of salt or make knife only run achievements like they did in Remake 1. I'm going to be honest, they have a really good idea with knife durability. That means that you cannot just constantly shoot a zombie in the legs, go behind them, spam the knife attack, slash them to death, and then you're okay. But they created a problem because now if you fight a boss, how will the knife work if you run out of, fucking durability for the knife only run? I think Remake 1 had the best idea in mind at the time when it came to having just your standard knife and then a defensive knife. So if a zombie grabs you, you use the defensive knife to defend yourself and stab him in the head. You can do that here, but it is equivalent to using your standard knife, so you have no other defense options if you run out of ammo and if you run out of your knife durability or if your knife gets lost. So there's a couple of ways to remedy this. I would say number one is to give the knife a longer durability. That would help at least take down one enemy and maybe one boss. I would also say that another way would be to go back to Remake 1 conventions, maybe give you defensive knives and then keep your standard knife, but the damage is so fucking weak that it's really not worth using. But let the speedrunners figure out a good way to get around the boss attacks and discover how to counterattack with the knife from there. I think a third option would be to maybe retool the knife. Maybe you could find upgrades. And I think maybe another option would be to do knife stacking, where the knives do break, they do have durability, but you can stack knives on top of each other. You can find like maybe 3 to 4 blades, make a limit so it's really just not totally unfair. Like, you shouldn't stack like 10 knives throughout the game and you'll be totally fine throughout the whole experience. I think you should look for them, find them, know where they are, put more pressure on the speedrunners, and go from there. And then the last option is to do some meta Kojima shit, right? And do something like Metal Gear Solid 3, where there are certain bosses that you can take out in different ways, like the end. You could take him out in so many ways, it is absolutely ridiculous. Maybe you can have alternative ways to kill bosses without using a gun, without using a knife. All I can hope for as a Resident Evil fan is praying that this reimagining remains expansive, but not to the point where it takes a giant dump on the original game and the elements they try to pursue. Everything looks good for now, despite some gut suspicions that some things might be removed instead of modified, but my fingers are crossed that my suspicions are wrong and they could expand on these things near the release date of the game itself. My biggest fear is that this game has to deal with being too drastically different, too drastically altered, to be even recognizable from the original Resident Evil 2. However, this is a Resident Evil 2 that is meant to update on the foundation of what made the original and what has been done so far, so I can't see that being done any other way than being modernized in certain areas. It's not the 90s anymore, it's not the early 2000s anymore. A new take needs to happen. They need to revitalize the survival horror genre. Even with my burning questions, I still prefer quality over quantity. Even with a one-to-one remake similar to the 2002 game, there would be people still bitching and complaining about the mechanics, saying they are outdated, so everyone is not going to be pleased either way it goes. All I can hope for as a Resident Evil fan is praying that this reimagining remains expansive, but not to the point where it takes a giant dump on the original game and the elements they try to pursue. Everything looks good for now, despite some gut suspicions that some things might be removed instead of modified, but my fingers are crossed that my suspicions are wrong and they could expand on these things near the release date of the game itself. My biggest fear is that this game has to deal with being too drastically different, too drastically altered, to be even recognizable from the original Resident Evil 2. However, this is a Resident Evil 2 that is meant to update on the foundation of what made the original and what has been done so far, so I can't see that being done any other way than being modernized in certain areas. It's not the 90s anymore, it's not the early 2000s anymore. A new take needs to happen. They need to revitalize the survival horror genre. Even with my burning questions, I still prefer quality over quantity. Even with a one-to-one remake similar to the 2002 game, there would be people still bitching and complaining about the mechanics, saying they are outdated, so everyone is not going to be pleased either way it goes. I do have my high hopes and I do have my reservations. However, I'm not going into this game expecting it to play like a game I played 20 years ago, because the times have clearly changed. That being said, Capcom is at least trying. They stripped away elements from typical action shooters, and they took a lot of what made the first remake done so well. They took a lot of that into advisement. Capcom has the arduous task of making this a giant amalgamation, making this tied together in a way where the game is fresh and it doesn't disrespect the source material, and so far, the latter is rubbing off on me. I can't wait to see more of how Resident Evil 2 Remake will unfold, with people like Brian Irons running amok and the mutations offered by William Birkin. It looks like it is coming along nicely, from the graphics to how they're handling over the shoulder to how hard it could be just to take down one zombie. If we're lucky, this could be one for the history books if done correctly. I'm especially interested in how Ada's expanded segment is going to be even longer, supposedly, according to the rumors, and hopefully it remains interesting. The same can be said for Sherry and her having an expanded segment, since I wasn't too fond of the side characters in the original Resident Evil 2. That's something they could fix entirely. It's going to be one hell of a ride as we ride our way into January 25th into Raccoon City again next year, and I will be looking forward to seeing how it all pans out. Maybe, just maybe, if this game does so well, it could bring up some interesting possibilities, like a standalone Resident Evil 3 Nemesis remake with some reused assets from this game put into there. My parting words remain the same. Let's just wait. Let's not freak the fuck out, and let's see what happens. Change can be for the better. The original Resident Evil 1 remake was 70% different from the original, and that was a masterpiece. A man can only hope that this will remain true for the Resident Evil 2 remake. My name is Renegade Operative. I will see you guys next time. This was a long, extensive video, and hopefully you enjoyed every single second. I will see you guys next time. Later.